Please now welcome our first panel of the day, which will explore the spectrum of capital investing in nature-based solutions. Towards the end of the panel, we will be taking questions from the audience, which will do so via Slido. So please do engage with the panel by visiting slido.com and entering the code that's on the screen. Rebecca Booth, Client Director at Carey, will moderate alongside panellists Dr. Gemma Cranston, Executive Director at Pollination Group, Ian Dunn, Chief Executive at Plant Life, James King, Senior Manager of Sustainability and Climate Change Consulting at PwC UK, and Andrew Mitchell, Founder of Equilibrium Futures and Vice Chair of the Stewardship Council of the Task Force of Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Please welcome our first panel of the day.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Please do use Slido with any questions that you feel that you have for the panel. I'll try and bring them in either through the discussion or at the end, depending on how we do. So welcome to our panellists, as you can see up on the screen. But thank you, Gemma, Ian, James and Andrew for joining us in Guernsey. Very nice for you to come over. Thank you very much. So Gemma, you've given us a fantastic overview of what's happening with the state of nature and natural capital. It really is very interesting on your overview there. I'm just going to ask the panel sort of to bring in more on that. So firstly, Ian, does this reflect what you're seeing in this space at the moment?
Yeah, thanks for a great keynote. Just before I answer that question, because I will answer the question, Plant Life is the UK's largest plant and fungi-based NGO. And when we start these sessions, I quite like to do a little bit of audience interaction. So bear with me. This may feel a little bit unusual to you, but bear with me, and then I'll get on to the question. So if you're happy to, what I would like you to do is just close your eyes and take... Yeah, we can all do this, yeah? And take a really deep breath through your nose. And then when you're ready, let it out through your mouth. And now do that one more time. And let it out. Now stand up really quickly. Not really quickly, stand up. And then sit back down again. Right, in 20 seconds, what you have demonstrated is the importance of nature. Because what we have just done is we've taken some sunlight and some water and some carbon dioxide and used it to make oxygen. You've just breathed in that oxygen and you've converted that to energy through carbohydrates. That is the fundamental basics of the importance of nature for all life on Earth, of which we are part of it. So I almost start off on these sessions by saying, well, what a great shame that we have to have conversations like COPs. And we have to have conversations like TNFD and TCFD, because it demonstrates just how far removed we have come from recognizing the importance of nature. Now, I'm a great supporter of TNFD. I'm a great supporter of many of these activities we have to take place on. But you in this room have a fundamental ability to drive change from your parts of your sector and society. And that's really important to recognize. And all of us in this panel have the ability to drive change. So in answer to the question, what I'm seeing is the dialogue is moving in the right direction in some regards. But as Gemma mentioned to you, it's a far broader dialogue than just looking at impacts and dependencies. And it's a far broader dialogue than just looking at quantification. And James will talk about the 44 trillion and some other numbers as well. The debate has to be far more holistic. Nature is really complicated. It's really complicated, and it's very easy to destroy and very difficult to rebuild. So the bit we're missing in some of our conversations, and it's fascinating to look at these various activities coming through. And I think, as Gemma mentioned, we talked about 30 by 30 at COP, 30% of land and oceans to be protected by 2030 for nature. And that's building off the Lawton Principles. You may or may not have heard of Lawton Principles. It's basically saying nature needs space. It's bigger, it's better, in better condition, and it's better connected. So when we are thinking about TNFD and when we're thinking about the COP, what we have to do as a global society is think about giving nature space. We've got to enable it to be resilient and healthy and thrive, and to give us the foundations of a healthy planet. So I love the debates we're having. I think there's quite a few gaps. We're still talking in silos. And I think you alluded to it, Gemma, that sense where if you've got the ability to influence, bring in the arts, bring in the culture, bring in the spiritual systems, bring in the belief systems, understand different ways of knowing. Think about indigenous peoples and local communities, of which we are all in a local community, and think about that in a financially relevant system for nature. And if we can do that, we will start to see the kind of impact we need to be making at pace and at the level we need. Because at the moment, and I think it was mentioned by maybe it was Ben yesterday on the opening speech, we're working a little bit too slow, too fragmented, and we're not going to have the impact we need in the time frame we have.
So how do you think we can actually put a value on nature in our economy? You know, it's such a big question and a difficult one to answer, but you say the importance of the arts, community, etc. But actually, how can we bring this into the economy and how we can work on that as a value?
Yeah, so I think, Rebecca, we have to bring it into the economy as a financial value, as a monetary value, but it's a great shame we have to do that. And I would really like us to be able to consider value in that broader sense. Now, I do think, slightly different to Gemma, I do think that biodiversity can be looked at from a national and a global relevance. And of course, in England, we are going to have biodiversity net gain. And there is going to be a degree of offsetting between on-site and off-site with all the contentious elements around it. So we are going to be able to price nature. And DEFRA came out 3 weeks ago with some unit prices for biodiversity. And that's probably the first time we've actually got to the point where they've said a value of a grassland unit is £25,000 or the value of a woodland is £40,000.
Yeah.
It's artificial, but it's a starting point.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, those frameworks as well, like you said, Gemma, are really important to try and build on what we have and to bring everything all together. Andrew, as you said as well, Gemma, that TNFD, I knew I was going to say TCFD. You know how that rolls off your tongue now, and now you have to add the N. So TNFD was launched this week at New York Climate Week. And Andrew, you were instrumental in building that out as a framework. Can you talk through the process on how you achieved this eventually as the final version? And what are the key items that we need to consider about that as financial service businesses?
Yeah, I will. It was my lockdown project.
Huh?
And I had recently returned to Jersey. I was a Jerseyman. And it's a sort of 50-year journey, so I'm going to make it really quick. I started out in rainforests as a zoologist, hugging orangutans and trees. And I couldn't save them that way. And my conclusion was it's all about the money. So now I hug asset managers and bankers instead. And that's a long journey, because I helped to create the Forest Footprint Disclosure Project, which was one of the first ones to sort of ask corporates, have you got a forest footprint? And the first question to ask, well, do you use forest risk commodities, which is a word we invented, or the idea, do you use palm oil? Do you use paper and pulp? Do you have any access to the beef supply chain and so on? And those questions are easy to answer, sort of yes or no. And that helped to sort of characterize most people. When you start with forest disclosure and they say, well, we don't do forestry. And that's not the point. They don't understand the question. So moving forward to the creation of the TNFD, I thought that we needed a cousin to the one on climate. And if you look at what happened in 2015, you got 200 governments sort of agreeing some pretty impressive targets on climate, and people needed a guidebook through the maze, and that was TCFD. So I thought if we had COP15, we could do the same trick, which was to get a strong agreement on nature at COP15 and then have a guidebook through the maze. I didn't expect COP15 to be delayed for a couple of years, but that was quite helpful as it turned out. So that was the basic thinking, is that how could we bring these two things together? And with TNFD, what I got when I started talking to governments about it was mostly, and corporates by the way, oh, we're really busy doing climate now, can't nature wait? And the second thing was, nature's really small. It's mainly agriculture and a few bees, and that's not very much of our GDP, depending on which country you're in the world. In the UK, it's about 4%. So, if you lost a lot, it's not the end of the world, kind of thing. It's small, go away again. And then the thing that happened, which is really useful, was COVID-19. Because that is a tiny piece of nature-related risk, so small you can't even see it, that came out of left field and changed everything. It turned our whole economy upside down. Of course, millions of people lost their lives. And everybody thinks of it as a health risk, but actually it was a brewed up environmental risk from zoonotic transfers of bugs to humans. Whether it was turbocharged along the way is still a debate, but that's basically what's going on. And so when I went back to Treasury after that, they started to say, I get it now. It's big. It's bigger than climate. It's faster than climate and affects every sector. And that's what we mean with that. That's the penny drop that we've got to realize that it isn't just about bees and bugs. It's about infrastructure that keeps the earth safe. This is what nature is really giving us. It's those bugs in the soil, plankton in the sea that do amazing things for us. And when you start talking that kind of language with finance, and language is so important, I understand investments in infrastructure, they say. They suddenly say, oh, well, there's an infrastructure play here. Is that what you're talking about? It becomes a different kind of conversation. So with TNFD, it's not easy. It was very difficult. There were 3,000 metrics on nature. There are no standards. There's no currency, like a ton of CO2. There's no target like 1.5 degrees. So it's really hard. There's nothing to hang it all on. So we thought we had to set about. We got 40 large institutions, financial bodies, and so on to work with us. We have 1,500 institutions in the TNFD forum and a tremendous amount of science bodies all feeding in. And the result is the framework, which was released on Monday in New York, and it will be launched again in London on next Monday. I guess what has stunned me about it is I thought it was going to be very difficult to get people to do this, and actually it's been remarkably easy. The TNFD acronym within the space of 18 months was known worldwide. I don't know, it's because having done climate, the next step is easier. And we've also deliberately made TNFD to be very similar to the TCFD in terms of process. So those of people who are thinking about it will be able to use the same kind of architecture to do TNFD. So looking forward to seeing it being used.
Yeah. So do you think then that businesses who are already calculating their carbon footprint will eventually be asked to calculate their biodiversity footprint?
You're asking me? Yes, I think so.
Anyone, actually.
Well, I've been waffling enough. Let someone else answer.
Yeah, I think so, because being the accountant in the room, what gets measured gets managed. And with net zero, it's a very clear journey. There's a very clear North Star of 1.5, and it's much more complicated with nature. So I think you absolutely have to start with that biodiversity footprint or nature-related impact footprint, so you have that baseline to know how you're progressing and going forward. And bumped into Gemma at the airport, and what we're discussing is just the need for businesses to start somewhere on nature, because we can't let perfect be the enemy of good and actually get in the way of getting started. We need to fail fast and learn, but we need that proof of concept. And also, you don't have to, obviously nature's big, it's complicated, but you don't have to do everything all at once. Most companies will already be doing something on nature, even if they don't recognize it. You know, almost all textile companies know their water footprint, work out what data you already have, and then, as the TNFD is very clear about, what's their most material, but just start somewhere.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I might just jump in on that, because I think there's a real danger that we're just focused on metrics and reporting out, and that's not the point of this. The point is to make the change, and you can manage that and you can look at progress over time, but it shouldn't be about my biodiversity footprint is X, which frankly doesn't really mean very much anyway, because it's going to depend on what measurement process you use. But if you can say, I have avoided or reduced or I've restored this much, and you can get on and do that now, that's a much better narrative to be able to share with people. So I think don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, but also let's just be clear on what we're trying to do. We're trying to deliver action, and we're trying to make a change. It's not about just reporting something in your annual report.
Yeah. It's actually, not to use the journey word because we don't like that, either of us, but it's actually a pathway on what you're going to be doing next.
It sounds really complicated, this whole thing. And what TNFD does is it gives you a sort of language and a way to get started. So if you look at it, you can get a grip on it. And then if you think of Guernsey, though, why should people care about this in Guernsey? You don't even have TCFD mandatory reporting in Guernsey. You do in the UK from 2025 onwards, so maybe it'll come to Guernsey. But we have a very big financial footprint, Guernsey, so does Jersey. And as our two centres, it's really big. So it's not what's going on in the island, it's our footprint worldwide with our money. So what are our funds doing? Are they investing in good things or bad things? Good for climate, bad for nature? We don't have that information mostly. And by joining Financial Centres for Sustainability, FC4S, you get to learn all about that, and you have to gather information. Our banking in islands like this tends to inherit policies from their parents, so they're more advanced, I would say. Trusts, massive family office businesses here. Most trustees, do they know what we're talking about on this panel? Not at all. And you get, well, we'll talk about this later, the next gen transfer, they're all interested in this stuff. So they're going to be wanting their advisors to be up to speed on these issues. It's a big upskilling required in islands like this on the issues we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think just coming in, if I can, I think the framework, what I really like about the framework is some of the language on disclose and discuss. It potentially opens up the discussion to many more people. It gives more people a voice in the corporate world, in the financial world, in the pensions world, etc. And that's really interesting. And if it does nothing more than give people a voice, I think that's very positive in that regard. Yeah. So I think in terms of is it the right thing to do from an NGO perspective, I think it is positive to do it, and it starts to enable different discussions to take place. It would be, and I think it's been alluded to, it'd be a great shame if it becomes an annual reporting stamp that says I've done this, that's it, I'm a good corporate citizen. That's not going to be enough. And I would encourage anybody in the room here to use it as a way of encouraging others to speak, to get other voices. And if you do a paradigm shift and you say, what if every Indigenous leader was paid the same as a successful fund manager? Or what if we had thousands of ecologists or natural scientists who were generating positive nature returns in the same way that you measure yourself on positive financial returns, and we pay them the same money? Now, wouldn't that be amazing if we could do that? And that's the kind of paradigm shift you can get to if you start to look at nature in a different way.
Yeah. Well, as you said, we have a huge reliance on nature, with over half of our GDP actually relating to that. In the new report from PwC that came out this year, we're actually looking at $48 trillion connected to nature. So James, can you talk through both your public and private capital ideas in reacting to TNFD?
Yeah, I think as Andrew Gemma said, the reaction has been mixed. You get some who are raring to go, who now it's been released, can press go on their projects, start to really turbocharge what they're already doing. Some financial institutions have been doing great work in the background, even through the beta releases, starting to test out new ideas. But then, as Andrew said, you get those who either don't get nature or just frankly have ESG exhaustion at this point. And a bit like, we've only just got our head around climate, and now you're saying there's this whole other thing we've got to do. And I can kind of get it, because without being controversial, climate change is actually relatively simple. It's a handful of greenhouse gases from sort of a dozen or so point emission sources. And then we always say nature is really complicated, but why is that? It's because, again, even if it was just biodiversity, that would be complicated enough, but it's not. It's soil quality, it's air quality, it's what's going on in our rivers and our oceans. It's so much to wrap your head around. So I think there is a bit of a journey of discovery to be done, a job for all of us are very bought in already for that education piece. But then, as Andrew was saying, what TNFD does brilliantly is it does try to start to simplify that in terms of aligning to TCFD language that financial institutions are already familiar with, and also stressing the materiality perspective. I think the private versus public markets, I mean, for your reflections, Andrew, what you've heard in conversations, I guess, given the route that TCFD took in terms of becoming mandatory for listed companies first, you are seeing public markets probably more interested in engaged on TNFD at the moment. And that is kind of quite a big risk, I think, because we're seeing with nature finance, there's this $700 billion nature finance gap a year. But within that, there's a huge missing middle of finance available. We've got lots of capital available in the sort of the startup, the grant, innovative grant. We have a few eye-catching 100 million blue bond deals and debt for nature swaps.
Yeah.
But this actual proof of concept scale-up capital, the sort of $5 to $50 million that really needs to be driven by the private markets, is what's missing. So it's crucial that there's a real concerted effort to engage with that segment of the market.
Yeah. So what type of structures are you seeing emerging to enable these capital flows?
Yeah, a lot around debt, I'd say. I think the release of TNFD's metrics will, I think, from discussions, maybe we'll see a bit of a drive now of more nature-related sustainability-linked loans and sustainability-linked bonds. As I said, you've got these very innovative, very large, but also very bespoke and quite difficult to scale, eye-catching conservation bonds, so the Rhino bond, or more and more debt for nature swaps. The Nature Conservancy are doing amazing work on that. They're starting to churn those out quite regularly now, which essentially, for those in the room, debt for nature swap in the simplest way possible enables governments, especially in the global south, to refinance their debt on more favourable terms, provided that the savings from that refinancing is then channeled towards conservation. So it's brilliant. It's a fantastic win-win, climate, just transition, nature. I think, as Gemma mentioned, and we'll go into more detail later in the panel, I believe, obviously most innovative forms coming from nature-based carbon credits, but increasingly biodiversity credits. And then, as we heard yesterday, more and more innovative insurance products. The amazing work Kita are doing on insuring nature-based carbon credits. It's really cool to see. You need to see more in that regard.
Yeah. So Gemma, you've already mentioned investment into natural capital. What type of barriers are you seeing?
So I think there's two big ones. One is return expectations, and the time. And I've mentioned the time bits. Actually, I think that there's another one, which is are the kind of projects, enterprises there that are ripe for the picking? And I think that's one of the big challenges that we've actually got. And we're having a look into this at the moment. We're trying to set up a new initiative that's essentially got biodiversity outcomes at the heart of it. Yeah. And that's what lots of the NGOs are doing. So the TNCs, Conservation International, WWF, but they're all dependent on grants. They're all expecting philanthropic support or from the DFIs or from whoever it might be. They're not getting any commercial capital. Okay. So how can we shift that and flip that to answer James's question? When we don't have the skill sets within those companies, within those enterprises, within those nature-based projects, because they're ecologists, they're conservationists, and they're brilliant at it, but they're not businessmen and women. So we're looking at, can we take other opportunities where there are existing projects that may have been in place for decades, conservation, restoration, regeneration, whatever it might be, and can we then go in and provide some commercial capital to them to say, we're expecting a return on this. This isn't something we're giving to you for free, but we're going to work with you so that we're going to help you identify what revenue streams you can actually generate, whether that's from carbon, whether it's from biodiversity nature credits, whether it's from something like ecotourism that perhaps they hadn't thought about, or you're harvesting some of the wild seeds and the berries, whatever it looks like, there are potentially ways to commercialize that entity so it becomes investable and bankable. And I think that's one of the key things that we need to overcome. And it comes back to that point of it's not an us and them type of thing. We need to speak a common language and we all need to come together to make it possible. But the data points aren't there at the moment. No one's actually shown that this is actually possible. And I think if what we are aiming to do. And I should call out, it's part of the Sustainable Markets Initiative. I don't know if many people will have heard of them. And looking to essentially transition and fill that gap that will then catalyse, hopefully, so you'll end up with lots more funds and opportunities in that space that's then going to support those other players, but with a patient capital approach and with that kind of more VC support type of mentality.
And just sort of building on that, so we're launching, or we've just had approved by the UK Intellectual Property Office, a certification for biodiversity enhancement that works on a piece of land and is an input determined certification. Now, it took 2 years working with the IPO to arrive at an input measure that they were prepared to say is a standard. Now, the reason we've done that is because you cannot categorically predict a biodiversity outcome. You can do lots of different things, and depending on the season or whatever happens, you get lots of different outcomes. So you can't say, I'm going to take this piece of land and I'm going to categorically give you a return of X in this time frame. What you can do is say, if I manage this land in a different way, it could be with regen agriculture, it could be with protecting it and then restoring it, whatever it might do. If I manage this land in a different way, I will get a biodiversity improvement, and that may generate credits. That's a secondary issue, it may not, but it will give you a biodiversity improvement. And it would be really interesting to have conversations with capital markets around how do you value an input determination rather than a return determination? Because I know how to take a piece of land and to improve it. And we know within Plant Life we've got experts who can do that. I can't guarantee it's going to be 10%, 15%, 20%, and it's going to be 5 years, 7 years, or 10 years. But it will be better.
Yeah.
So how do we value that?
Well, that's actually, Andrew, something that you've been working with in family offices in different jurisdictions, looking at how you can actually get money into projects. You must have had to do some type of valuing for that as well. Do you see it more sort of private capital going into this versus philanthropy, or do you feel that there's still a philanthropic edge to family office type investing?
I think there's a tussle going on between values and valuations. And family offices is very interesting because they own a lot of big companies. They're interesting also because they're very relevant for islands, IFCs like Jersey and Guernsey and others. And there's going to be a massive wealth transfer from baby boomers to Gen X and beyond, of depending on, the numbers are in the trillions of $35 to $68 trillion over the next decade or so. I mean, it's absolutely huge. So there's going to be a big transfer of wealth to younger people and also to women, because husbands that usually had the money are dying and leaving it to their wives, and women are becoming owners of big businesses. And the finance advisory industry is supremely poorly equipped to deal with both of those issues. The 35-year-old billionaire who walks into a trust office and says, I want to make the whole of my portfolio sustainable, how would you do that? And they go, is not the answer they're looking for. And only about 11% of financial advisors today in Britain have any policies in place to deal with women being the owners of capital, according to a survey by Schroders. They're all geared up for men, because that's basically who had all the money before. So it's a huge change and a very interesting one, because young people care about this stuff much more than old people, and women care about it more than men. So those two things are going to mean there's a big shift in capital and the way capital can be deployed. And they're going to be looking for things to put their money into. And I think one of the things we need to do is to widen out what we mean by a nature-based investment or a natural capital investment. It tends to be, the default is plant trees or agriculture. It's way bigger than that. It's about a reimagining of real estate and the way it's built and the impact it has on the landscape. I was just talking in Hong Kong last week with Swires on a panel their Swire Properties, and they're rethinking the way they do their property portfolios to make connectivity with nature an important theme. Connecting, so when you build a new estate, how can you create corridors for wildlife to connect them with public parks and all that sort of thing? Cladding buildings, not with concrete, but with nature, putting, you've seen them, cascading bits and all this kind of thought, that's all in infrastructure. Think of vertical farming, for instance, which is an infrastructure play, a simple way to repurpose vertical buildings as farms instead of offices. Thinking about that in London. Actually, I said to John Williams, who was very proud of the PwC building, that it was one of the most energy efficient buildings because there's no one in it. They're all working at home. So I said, turn it into a vertical farm, John. Why did you do that? A bit horrified by it. But so there's a few more coming in. You can all be farmers in there as well on the side. So this vertical farming is another very important thing. The other thing to think of is alternative proteins, which is growing out, and precision fermentation. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That's basically taking things like funguses and turning it into a soup, and then it makes anything.
Yeah.
Think of using black soldier flies to feed on plant waste in Guernsey and feed aquaculture with that. So we don't have to take anchovies out of the sea to feed shrimp farms in Indonesia. You can use the palm oil waste to create little maggots and turn it into pellets for fish. These are huge, huge potential new nature-based industries. So what happened with climate? It's like a balloon at a child's party. You squeeze it here and something pops out the other side, and what popped out was called renewable energy. And I think what's going to happen, the pop out in nature is going to be renewable food. It's a complete revolution in the way we feed ourselves and the entire supply chain in the way I've described. So I think there's really big potentials there that families, and I know they're already looking at it.
Yeah, so they're
they're
already
going to be into
investing
this sort
in
of stuff.
this.
Yeah.
Or donating to it, almost as
Not donating, it's investments.
It's investments.
Philanthropy is
okay.
important because often philanthropy kicks it off because you need risk capital. It's as you were saying earlier, Gemma, it's really hard to get the money in. We may talk about that a bit more in the next panel. You often need governments to put in guarantees. You create layered funds, blended finance. You've probably heard of blended finance.
Yeah.
So governments come in first to take the most severe risk, then development finance after that, and retail on top. I've advised on many funds like that. For impact investing, and we're still in that zone.
Yeah.
I wish we could break out of it, but we're not quite out of it yet.
So, James, I think this is a good opportunity just to discuss then what risks you see for nature in bringing in more capital, both from the philanthropic side and from institutional forms of capital as well.
Yeah, slightly different question.
Yeah.
I guess I'll caveat everything I'm going to say with there's a much bigger risk we don't bring enough capital in, full stop. But obviously, there are big risks to nature if we bring it in and do it wrong. If you, as Jem said, you need the right experts partnering with the finance to actually on the ground to make this happen well, so that you don't accidentally, when you're trying to rewild an estate, introduce a non-native species, for example. Or I think you've got to be really careful when you're on that monitoring, reporting, and verification journey. If you say a positive improvement happened when it didn't, well, then we're in a much worse situation. We think we've cracked it, but we're right back where we started, or worse. But I don't think that's novel to nature. I think that's like any industry at the start. You've got to be careful. You've got to do it right. Got to do it careful. We will get it wrong sometimes, but as long as we learn and move quickly and learn quickly, there's only sort of 6 harvests till 2030 is the stat that often gets pushed around. The philanthropy point's very interesting. I think building on what Andrew said, I think my big fear with that is when philanthropic finance or concessional finance or pure charitable donations get used when on projects or opportunities that could be commercially viable. We have this massive financing gap for nature, and we have a very small, in the grand scheme of things, pool of public concessional philanthropic funds available. I think it's really important that a big chunk of that is used to be catalytic, blended finance, proof of concept. But not every element of nature is going to or should generate a return on investment. Some bits will just need pure, protection for public good. And so it's critical we don't waste the sort of scarce resources and scarce capital we have that's needed for those endeavours on opportunities that could and should be generating a commercial return on investment.
Yeah. Gemma, do you agree with that position?
I do, and I think it's the different roles that each of these players have to play, and it's the catalytic elements that I think is really interesting. So I might flip this because I was talking about engaging with some of the large CPGs, the Marses and the Unilevers of the world. You don't want to put their money where their mouth is in terms of supporting developed North farmers. And I was sort of scratching my head. I was like, well, we know what you do with the Global South. You go to the DFIs and you bring philanthropy in and da 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 da. And someone said to me, they'd still be interested. Philanthropy would still be interested in that because they're catalysing a change. So if you get, I don't know, the philanthropists put in £10, maybe the corporates put in £20, and maybe that then, because you've de-risked it, you've got that first loss element, then suddenly you're unlocking the remaining £80 of the £100 aim that you're getting for. And I was like, that's really interesting because we've got to shift everywhere. And I think it is about how's the money deployed smartly, but not being constrained and missing out on opportunities, essentially. And I think don't think anyone's got it right yet. And I think that we probably need more sustainable finance options. But we just got to have a go at it. And I think, back to my point around data points, we just have to trust that the shift's happening and it's going to happen and we're going to ride that wave rather than waiting for it to all have been perfectly, all the I's dotted and the T's crossed.
Yeah.
We haven't got time for that.
I suppose we see that this is a bit more formalised is with these, the credits that are coming and that. How's biodiversity, how are they really different than the carbon offsets? I mean, we've spoken about it a little bit, but maybe Ian, you could just open our eyes to a bit more to that.
Yeah, I think they're potentially very interesting. And I have an oil and chemical background, and you have a physical asset. So you have, when you're trading oil, for example, you can have a ton of oil or barrel of oil, whatever you use, and it can be traded multiple times. But there's always a physical, tangible asset at the back of a trade. Now, biodiversity credits are potentially really interesting compared to carbon credits. And those of you who've watched the fires in the west of Canada and Greece and so on and so forth, that's an awful lot of carbon credits gone. They've disappeared. And of course, at the moment that the amount of write-downs of carbon credits in the voluntary market is running into the hundreds of millions. So carbon credits have got to a point where they're a very interesting example of how biodiversity credits maybe can be better. And the big difference is, I think, is the tangible link of a credit. So every single biodiversity credit should be linked to a piece of land which is on a register. So you can audit it, you can measure it, you can look at what's happening, you can physically visit it. And biodiversity credits in that sense could be a bit of a game changer. And I actually think the voluntary market for biodiversity credits is going to be bigger than the statutory markets. There's very, very few. There's probably no statutory markets until November. But the voluntary market's going to be very big. Mm-hmm. We've just signed our first £8 million deal for a charity like Plant Life. That's a pretty big deal, with National Highways to generate 660 biodiversity credits. Now that's a game changer. Highway don't have to do this legally, but what they recognise is managing their estate is having an impact. And they've given us the task of generating the credits for them, and over the next 15 years we'll generate these 600 credits, all of them linked to a piece of land to a landowner. And that could be a really interesting breakthrough in terms of how we work with biodiversity credits. I think what Aviva did, where Aviva put 100 million into nature in the UK, was a really interesting move, because they set a level, they set a bar which was very tangible. Now, they've also said, and I just want to come back to something supporting what Gemma said and philanthropy with James. What they've also said is that most of that 100 million has to go into buying land. Buying land is an early entry solution to this, but it is not the answer. And with philanthropists, you see a lot at the moment, and high net worth individuals, they're exercising their value proposition on nature by buying land. You can only do that so far before you become a colonizer or a land occupier against the local populations. And at that point, it's going to start going negative.
You've got that social impact, haven't you?
You've got the social
in
impact.
this,
You've got to keep the
isn't
social
always
impact.
talked about,
Yeah.
but it's actually intrinsic to
It is,
these nature
absolutely.
solutions.
And that's why biodiversity credits can work differently from land ownership. And that's where they could be a very significant financial play.
Yeah. We've had a Slido question that's had 6 likes, so I don't feel I can ignore it. Gemma, what nature-based solutions have you seen garner interest and investment returns from the private sector from your work with climate asset management?
So, I mean, we've probably touched on most of them. Regenerative agriculture. So there we've got examples where we've gone in and there's completely degraded land, pastures, and they've seen an opportunity to go in and restore that, but a business opportunity, and so they're basically planting almond groves.
Okay.
And then that's, again, supporting local communities who can then go in and farm and so on and so forth. So
Do almonds not take up a lot of, need a lot of irrigation?
they do,
Yeah.
but I think it's better than what they had before, which was just degraded. And I think they selected particular locations where they know it's not going to be dry and arid.
Okay.
And obviously you need lots of pollinators as well. So you've got a whole range of different plays that you need to put in place. Sustainable timber is another opportunity that's very live. I think the challenge often is it's about purchasing land and doing better with that land. And I think these sorts of funds, so CAM have, there's a slither of it that's looking around the payment for ecosystem services piece, but the agriculture and the forest is the piece that's really driving that element forward. So I think we need to do more, but we also need to recognise that it's not just about purchasing the land and then holding on to it for 10 years and then selling it off and the value just happens to have gone up, but it's about what you do with that land and making it more productive and more biodiverse and create better ecosystems within that space that I think is going to be more beneficial in the longer term.
Okay, great. What else do we have as a question? This is quite interesting. I mean, we're going back to TNFD. I think we spoke about it a lot, but there is another question on it. Is TNFD only relevant for large listed companies? I think we've kind of said, no, it's not. Start now. It's moved up. Hold on. So should SMEs be thinking about what should SMEs be thinking about in terms of reporting regulation and nature impact? Do you want to discuss this again, or do you want me to move on to the next question? Does anybody want to add anything?
These things tend to start with the big listed companies, and that's probably why so much money is going to private equity, because they don't have to tell anybody what they're doing. But I'd love to know what private equity is doing about TNFD. Actually, I'm not sure how much information we've really got about that. Whether but I think most people, whether you're big or large, are aware of the fact that we can't ignore this issue. And whether you're a small company or a big company, you will have some connectivity with nature. And therefore, just like climate, you've got to start to get au fait with all of this. And it's a way to do that. So what you then change, just as Gemma says, disclosure, it's like watching car crashes on a motorway. Oh, so we've got 1,000 a day. That's nice. Then what? You've got to do something about it. And then you ask the manufacturers, well, stop humans driving cars. Let's go for driverless cars. That could be a policy decision. So disclosure only gets you so far. It can change the cost of capital, which is interesting. Those who do disclose maybe get access to cheaper money than those who don't. So that can affect a small company or a big company.
Yeah,
so it all depends on what reaction this disclosure has in the market itself.
Yeah, I suppose with private equity can drive the smaller companies that they're investing in to make more disclosures to them with a view to actually applying TNFD and getting more data through so that then they can make decisions about their investments and also what they can do to have a nature positive impact as well, because it seems from the discussion that we've been having it's intrinsically linked. Net zero and achieving that and nature and biodiversity it is linked so much that you can't really talk about one without the other.
So I'll just give you one simple statistic. Do you know how much CO2 there was in the world a billion years ago or so? It was 95%. Do you know how much CO2 there is in the atmosphere today? What's the percentage of it? Anybody know? Guess? 20%? 10? It's 0.04%. So it went from 95 to 0.04%. And it wasn't an industrial carbon capture and storage machine that did it. It was trees and plankton. That's why nature is a really important part of reaching climate goals.
Yeah. Oh, that's
I
great.
think on the SME question as well, SMEs I think are really important for this. I don't think they need to do TNFD in the way that the framework is, but by their very nature, they're often more local. They're less international. They're very well connected. There's lots of them, so it's sort of volume versus value. And I think as Andrew mentioned, we're seeing a really very different value set coming from startups and from the leadership of SMEs.
Yeah.
And I think they will do it through choice. And that's how they will win their customer, and it's how they'll win their client base and their growth. So I think SMEs are really fascinating to work with, and they all have different nuances, but probably get it more than some of the big companies.
Yeah.
I think they'll do it by choice, but I think just as we've seen on climate with Scope 3, how that is then, as companies are under more and more pressure to understand their Scope 3 emissions throughout the value chain, has put that reporting pressure down onto their suppliers and SMEs.
Yeah.
We will see the same with SMEs on nature, probably not in the immediate term, but again, that will happen more and more, I think, especially as companies are trying to get to grip with understanding the data requirements of reporting on their nature impact. So I think it'll be a push-pull factor for SMEs.
Yeah, and I suppose with the ISSB and S1 and S2 as well, there'll be more of a reliance on these companies through the chain to actually provide it through as well. Yeah. So there's obviously lots of other questions that people would like to ask. We will have a break at some point so you can grab people for coffee. But Gemma, we've discussed a lot of different ways on how nature has impacts and understanding the value, whether that's monetary or society or climate and all of those different points to it, and how to invest as part of the solution to the climate crisis. But to close off this panel, can you explain how you feel long-term community-focused solutions are needed in a typically quick wins mindset?
So as I've said, communities are critical to delivering this. And maybe I could just give a really nice example.
Yeah.
So there is did anybody know what the driver is behind kelp forests disappearing? I didn't know the answer to this. It's sea urchins. They come in and they are decimating kelp forests across the world. Well, there's this amazing company who said, do you know what we should do? We should go and remove those urchins. But they don't have the rights to be able to do that. It's the local fishermen. So there's your community that you need to engage, who can go in, who can extract those urchins. And what do they do with them? They sell them to Michelin-starred restaurants for big bucks. And it's incredible. And I've seen the videos. Between 3 and 6 months, these kelp forests have restored themselves. So think of the carbon that they're sequestering. Think of the nurseries that they're enabling for the fish. And it's amazing. But the communities are at the heart of that. They can't do it without them. And I'll just leave it at that, I think.
Yeah. Eat more sea urchins.
Eat more sea urchins, exactly.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Gemma, Ian, James, and Andrew. Fantastic discussion. Thank you.